Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life, not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at Facebook.com/Virtual Memories Show, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. That'll inspire Apple to promote us a little. And of course, you can also promote us by telling people about the podcast on social media or however else you publicize the things you like. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/VMSPod and set up your level of support. You'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/VMSPod or paypal.me/VMSPod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. All right, things have been a little less crazy of late than they've been the past few months. I'm figuring on a pretty quiet week leading into Memorial Day weekend, so that's good. There'll be a whole ton of work, but I'm hoping not a lot of the extraneous stuff that I've been alluding to without telling you about. This all probably signifies that everything's going to go off the rails, and I'll be a stress monster for the next couple of weeks, but for now, I'm enjoying the relative silence. There's all sorts of stuff going on, as I'd said. It's personal. It's stuff I don't want to get into, which I thought was harmful, but then I talked to a pal of mine about it over the weekend, and it actually felt worse doing that than just keeping things to myself and my immediate family. So all you need to know is I am 6 weeks ahead on the podcast, so I might be in a pretty good place for a while. Now, this week's show features Ilana C. Myer, author of the new novel Fire Dance from Tor Books. Ilana and I met at a party a few years ago and then again at ReaderCon that summer. But I was a heel, and I managed not to record with her when her debut novel came out in 2015, Last Song Before Night, also from Tor. So with Fire Dance coming out this spring, I wanted to make sure we got together so we could talk about writing, fantasy, her double life in America and Israel, why I'm a heel and should feel guilty about not recording with her a few years back, that sort of stuff. And she ended up letting me off the hook as far as the guilt thing goes, but it's still a fun conversation. And I enjoyed both of her novels, even though anyone who knows me knows that the fantasy genre isn't my thing. And I got to say, my enjoyment of those books is a testament to the strength of Ilana's writing, the compelling characters she creates and the choices they have to make, and her skill at world building, which we get into during the episode. Both novels, well, they take place in a world where magic used to exist and is creeping back, and where poets and singers lead these highly regarded but kind of symbolically empty lives. And that changes over the course of Last Song Before Night, and the whole stage changes pretty drastically for Fire Dance. So it's I don't want to give away too much about it. I enjoyed both books, like I said. They're not just quest novels. They're not cute. They're not dragon novels. They're very thoughtful, and they have really good characters and a fun array of stories to them. Now, there are two caveats here. One is that a lot of the conversation is sort of variations on my question of how Ilana has changed as a writer from her first book to her second. And that's I don't let that go exactly because I'm really impressed with both novels, but I'm really curious as to how she sees her progress as a writer from the inside. Given that most of the artists I record with and writers are older, they've got a bigger body of work behind them. I'm really fascinated by, what she saw and what's changed for her from book 1 to book 2 and what she thinks is going to change going forward. The other caveat is lawnmower and fish tank, both of which were making noise throughout the episode. The lawnmowers for the first 10 or 15 minutes. The fish tank was burbling the entire time. Scrubbing those sounds out kind of left some audio artifacts. If you're not happy with the quality of the audio, I will give you your money back. Now here's Ilana's bio. Ilana C. Myer has worked as a journalist in Jerusalem and a cultural critic for various publications. As Ilana Teitelbaum, she has written book reviews and critical essays for the Globe and Mail, the Los Angeles Review of Books, Salon, and the Huffington Post. Last Song Before Night was her first novel, followed by Fire Dance. She lives in New York. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Ilana C. Myer. So you're back from a book tour.
Yes. Thank God that's over.
How did it go? What did you learn on this tour compared to running around for the first book?
Well, the one for the first book was in some ways, misleading experience because it was my first and because it was with 2 other writers who were also debuts. So the 3 of us didn't really know much. And we were all trying to basically read the tea leaves to understand what the heck was going on and what we were supposed to be doing. And I mean, we all had varying degrees of expertise in this. I would say Fran Wilde knows more than most authors about how the industry works. But even so, we were all kind of winging it, and it was crazy. And that was in 2015. At this point, 3 years later, I wouldn't say I've become more cynical because that would be really difficult, given how cynical I already was. But I had, at that point, developed an attitude of, everyone is going to tell me something different about what I should be doing and how I should be presenting myself. And nobody really knows anything, so I'm just going to do what feels right to me. Mm-hmm. And that made the experience much better. It was like, I'm not going to be trying to hang on to people's feedback or, try to glean crumbs of approval. I'm just going to do what feels right to me, because I suspect that is in the end what everybody is forced to do. Because there's just no right or wrong answers to how to present yourself in your book, because everyone is different and everyone's book is different.
Mm-hmm. How did it go in terms of actually, audience response? Did they dig the readings? Was it fun? Was it fun for you in terms of that interaction?
It was. There was even the experience at one reading where the bookstore owner said that she had never listened to a reading where the audience was so silent. She said that you could hear a pin drop and people were just focused on the reading. That was quite wonderful. I did feel like it was a good response. And, people actually bought books afterwards, which is always a good sign.
That was sort of my next question. Did you sell books? That's really critical.
Yes, that's what you hope for. And that was one of the things that happened.
Now, beyond the book tour aspect, what did you learn in the process of writing and publishing your first book and then your second? What changed from first to second for you along those lines? What did you figure out about yourself in the course of actually publishing Last Song Before Night? And then how difficult or, how much did it change going into Fire Dance?
Well, one thing I learned is that you really can't predict how people will respond to the work, and that there will be many, many responses. And so one thing I realized I had to do if I was going to maintain my sanity and my creative integrity was not pay attention to the responses, even the positive ones. Because if someone just says, this was amazing, but
I wish you did X instead.
Or if they just said, this is amazing, but they don't seem to really tap into what I was trying to do anyway, then that's just as useful as the person who is, this is the worst book I ever read. And I mean, it's nice to get that gratification, but it's not useful. And so I felt like it was really important to try to detach from all the voices, because that's the sense that I get when, from the internet, that there's all these voices, and just shut out those voices and write the book I needed to write, even though all those voices are also telling me, you've probably seen this on Twitter, there's a lot of stuff on Twitter about what everyone wants to be reading now. Someone should write an X novel. Someone should write a novel with dragons and, of course, dragons. Those are perennial.
Always with the dragons.
But, and I don't even want to get into it. This is on my wish list of what to read, and I think that's important to ignore that too. So.
How much of a sabbatical did you take from social media in the course of the second book?
I couldn't. I don't think an author can do that. Mm-hmm. I wish we could. So it was more a matter of attitude, of internalizing, just being like, that's being said over there, and I can't let it affect the process, because the process does its own thing. It is very organic.
What you should talk about. What is the process? What was the process for this one in comparison to the first one, which took many years from everything I've read?
Yes, the first one took many years. I had no idea when I began that it was going to take so long, but I did have a lot of demands on my time. I started what would become Last Song Before Night after taking a class in college, which included Celtic literature, which included literature about the Celtic poets. And we didn't read much about it, but just that concept just seemed like something that would be really meaningful to me in terms of exploring what art means to me. Because here's this idea of artists who have power in the world, so what they do really matters. And because I wanted a more sophisticated society than the medieval Celts, I combined that with the troubadours. And so that was the beginning of the process. And then that combined with other things that were probably unconscious, and that took 7 years. Mm-hmm. And then another few years before it was revised and published and everything else. With Fire Dance, I had not even been planning a sequel to Last Song Before Night. It was on submission when I had the idea for the book initially. I had gone to Seville and Cordoba and really relished the contrast there, that mingling of Islamic and Christian aesthetics that I had not seen elsewhere in Europe. I went home and I read more about it, and suddenly I could picture Lynn in that setting, and I called my agent and said, hey, I think I might have an idea for a sequel. And he's like, oh, well, I'm sure the publisher would like to know that. And then the next thing I knew, I had a 3-book contract, and I was like, well, I said one sequel, but honestly, as a fantasy writer, I do have that. But yes, you know what I'm going to say. There is that nice, well, not so much series as the idea of thinking big.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, so I'll just make it a really big story and cut it in half, which actually is not what I did. But initially that just seemed like that could work. In the end, Fire Dance is really self-contained in terms of its emotional arc, and then it leaves things open for the next book, which is also going to be very different. At this point, I think of it as a triptych, like 3 paintings that are connected, but each one has its own internal structure and story.
What did you learn about storytelling, rhythm, and construction over the course of this, and balancing that with, I want to say strong characters, not in terms of, they're all strong and butch, but, just very vividly drawn characters, balancing that with relatively intricate storytelling.
Very intricate storytelling. At
I
one
don't know why I said relatively, but go on.
I mean, I don't know if people can tell or not, but, at one point I bought a whiteboard because I was so desperate. I was like, I have to figure out how to keep these plots straight. But in the end, I actually never used it. I seem to have a natural tendency to complex plots. I don't know if that is a point in my favor. It makes things very difficult. And then I need to make an effort to make sure that it's not confusing. And I actually had several people read it to make sure that it wouldn't be too confusing. Wait, that wasn't your question.
Well, the question, where did you learn storytelling, rhythm, and method along those lines? And how did you fine-tune that from book 1 to book 2?
I think...
Did you feel, I guess my over question is really, did you feel like a different writer on the second book than the first?
It took some time, but after several attempts, I began to feel like a different writer. At first, I would write 20,000 words, and it was terrible, and I threw it out. And then I wrote another 20,000 words, and it was terrible, and I threw it out. And I was actually quite miserable. On book tour, I remember I was just completely miserable about how the book was going because I knew what I had written was bad, but I didn't know why. And so at a certain point, I kept throwing it out. And then I just remember when I finally wrote those 50,000 words that I knew I could keep, I was so thrilled. But it was really a process. And I might have grown more in that process than I did even writing the first book, because writing the first book was...
a sort of open-ended experience, or at least one without that set of expectations. I don't want to put words in your mouth, though. Yeah.
I certainly learned a lot from the process, but it was also a bit... I wasn't thinking at the time about the genre at all when I wrote the first book. I wasn't thinking about the commercial demands, like the stakes. The stakes. They talk about the stakes a lot, how you have to raise the stakes. For the last Song Before Night started out having like very low stakes, and then in order for it to be published, I actually had to like do open heart surgery on it and make it more commercial. And so what was nice about writing the second book was I knew going in that I had to have high stakes so I wouldn't have to do open heart surgery on the book. And so at first I envisioned, okay, so they want high stakes, so I'll just make it like this big war. And that was why it kept failing, because actually that bores me a lot.
Mike Cole is out there. He's got his stuff, and he's a pal and a past guest, so I'm not goofing. But.
No, that's his thing, military fantasy. But then there's epic fantasy, and you'll meet, lovely people who write books about, giant battles. And I was like, okay, I have to do that. I'll make it fun. It'll be fine. But I just couldn't do it. I just don't find it interesting enough. And so then it really became a story about character. And that made it more complicated also. It wasn't just going to be a book about how there are bad guys and you have to fight the bad guys. It really became something that dug deeper and went and took a more twisted path.
It's not. Yeah, never mind.
What are you thinking?
No, I was just gonna say it's not funny, because you actually, especially in the first book, you manage to portray an evil character who convinces people that he's redeemed himself, but turns out to be monstrously evil when he gets the opportunity. Oh,
that's one of my favorite parts of the book.
Yeah. No, I thought it was incredibly deftly pulled off in terms of getting it's like, maybe he's actually kind of changed, and no, he's that horribly evil person. So, well done in that respect. Yeah, I guess that question is what sort of characters appeal to you besides, monstrously evil hiding it, but
oh, yeah, no, that character in particular doesn't appeal to me. That was more a matter of how people always think, how could she be so stupid? How could she think that guy was really okay when he's so obviously a cad? I wanted to, with that part of the book, I wanted to seduce the reader so that they would have that same experience as the girl who...
Oh, as a former cad, I say you pulled it off very well.
I am not sure that's the endorsement that works. But...
Oh, no, trust me. In this case, it does. Former cad. That's why I could say it's good. But what was it like, the writing for a sequel versus the standalone initial concept, which, again, I know revolves around that idea of contrasting the first and second books for you. Was it that sense of, hey, I've actually got something here I can really expand into, and is there going to be something beyond a third book? But I'm going to leave you.
I'll try to answer in order. I'm not so good at answering your questions directly, for which I apologize.
I'm terrible at asking them, so that's all right.
No, I tend to go on these divergent paths, and you can always bring me back when you need to, if you want to.
That's what conversation's all about.
Okay. What I did differently in the second book was I seeded things that I plan to use later. There are just certain threads that I began that I knew I was not going to be resolving in that book, in contrast to the ones that I knew I would be. So basically, it's two arcs. There's the arc that is resolved in the book, and then there's the wider arc that can only be resolved in the third. And so knowing that going in, certain seeds that I planted that I had planned to come to fruition later. And your other question was, whether it will go beyond 3 books. The answer is no, it will not. Because I wrote...
No need to say.
No,
okay, unless it's something plot-driven, I mean. So.
No, it's not plot-driven. I initially wrote a standalone novel for a reason. I love the concept of a self-contained story. I just think that's beautiful to me. And a series that goes on forever, I don't think I've ever come across one that really was improved by being as long as it was and going on forever. I think quitting while you're ahead is a good idea artistically, if not commercially. I understand commercially, perhaps it isn't. So...
What did it feel like when you first saw bound copies of Last Song Before Night?
Oh, I don't know. That was so crazy. It was, of course, really exciting. But because the process is so long and fraught, by the time I got to that point, I was just exhausted.
Yeah. So you didn't have the exhilaration, you had more just a sigh when you opened the box?
Yeah, it's a weird business. Everything takes so long that the opportunities for excitement are really kind of something you have to grab onto or you're going to miss them. Mm-hmm. Because it's like, oh, yes, finally it's coming out.
Oh, that's right, my novel.
Yeah.
First time you saw it in a bookstore? Or would it have been around a sign?
That was pretty crazy.
Yeah?
That was when we still had a Barnes & Noble here in my neighborhood, and so we could just walk over and see it on the shelf. That was really special. Mm-hmm.
Did you pull the Neil Gaiman thing and start signing your copies surreptitiously? Or not?
Well, I actually had an event in that bookstore, so I signed stock for them. But, yeah. Because
apparently that's his thing. Just airport bookstores, he'll just stop and sign his books and split, figuring no one's going to stop him and buy them. So. That's a weird question.
Go for it.
Women in science fiction and fantasy.
Okay.
Issues, around gender balance, equity, or inequities, etc., or you feel pretty much like you're you as a writer and representation is less of an issue than maybe it was?
I don't know. Yeah. I so completely despise the idea of being a woman writer. I think it's so disgusting. Sometimes I think I would have been smarter to use initials or something. It's obviously too late for that. I do wonder if it's hard to not to wonder if my work would be taken more seriously if and we're writing it, but it's too late for that. Mm-hmm. And these things are so deeply psychological that we can't legislate them away, and we can't really do much about them except keep talking about it, I guess.
But you did do one name change as an author. You're Ilana Myer.
Yes.
Okay.
Why?
Yeah.
Well, I got to tell you, since I was a teenager and planning to become an author, I was never going to have Teitelbaum on a book cover because it's so damn long, and Americans can't pronounce it. They say Teitelbaum. It just seemed like the obvious thing. I mean, when you find out movie stars' real names, it's hilarious. They know what to do. You don't keep, Moskowitz or whatever as your
Yeah. I'm as a guy who only has 7 letters and 2 names, I'm Jewish, but I can pull it off with, just the weird Gil Roth. What a strange name,
Yeah, it wasn't the Jewishness. It was more just, keeping it short. And Myer actually is my grandmother's maiden name, and there's some meaningfulness attached to it. So it wasn't, I didn't want to pull a name out of the air, and I didn't want to de-Jewify it. I just wanted it to be shorter and be something that Americans could pronounce.
Yeah, tell me about, and this is a weird question, picking names.
Yes.
In your fiction, given you got a mix of different cultures.
Yes.
Fictional cultures, but, we know who the Jews are in them.
Well, you do. I don't know if everyone does.
I know, but, as a constantly, paranoid Jew, that tends to be the, looking for the code in characters. But, that process of picking names and trying to figure out ways of naming characters are going to stay internally consistent within the histories and the realities that you picked. Weird, or one of those, Gil, you're overthinking it questions?
It's really hard to describe. It's, on the one hand, a very intuitive process. It kind of just has to fit the character, and I can't describe how that happens. And then on the other side of it is, does this look and sound consistent with the kind of milieu that this character is from? And for Kahishi, I actually did steal a lot from Hebrew. Because I didn't think most people would know the difference between Semitic languages. But, obviously I played with that as well. Mm-hmm.
And you wrote most of the first book while living in Israel.
Yes, actually.
All of it?
Yes. Except for the revisions I had to do later to make it more commercial. I wrote it in Israel.
And spent your teens and most of your 20s there?
I can tell you I'm
how many years of your life, I guess?
Yes. No, let me explain this in a way that I hope won't be too confusing. I lived in New York until I was 12. Then my parents brought me to Israel, to Jerusalem, and I lived there until I was around 18. I'm pretty sure I left to go to college, to come here. I came here to New York for college. I went to Queens College because that was the place I could go where I could afford. And then I was here from the age of 18 or so until I was about 24. And then that was where I met my husband. And so we got stuck there for 6 years. Came back when I was, yeah.
He's waving.
He's waving. Came back when I was 30. So it's been back and forth a lot, and it's a little bit crazy. But what I think that I got from that is I experienced Israel both as a helpless kid during a very tumultuous political time, but I also experienced it later as an adult and professional who had to make a living and learn the ropes of how to live in the country, and also as a journalist had the experience of encountering people and worlds that I otherwise never would have. And I feel like so even though I didn't spend my whole life there, I feel like it was a substantive experience overall.
Mm-hmm. I haven't been back since my bar mitzvah, so there were tons of family over there.
It's changed a lot since your bar mitzvah.
Yeah, you would have been tiny. Yeah.
I don't think so.
I'm 10 years older than you.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was, you'd have been 2 or 3, I guess. I was going to say there's never a non-tumultuous time to be there, by the way, when you mentioned
that is true.
Your first stretch.
That is true, but the Oslo process particularly was something something we still talk about. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you get back at all nowadays?
I do. I have my whole family is there.
Oh, mine too, but I haven't been back in 30 years.
Well, by whole family, I mean my parents and siblings.
That would be more of an inducement for me to stay here, but I'm just kidding. That's fine. But how does the book reflect your experience of Israel? The first book, I mean.
Well, I wouldn't say it's a direct reflection, but I was 25 in Jerusalem at the time. And I think looking back I used to, after writing in the morning, I used to take long walks. This was the first year I was there when I didn't have to work yet because my father had offered to support me for a year. This was how he got me to come back. It was a whole bribe system.
Oh, so you have a reason to go back to Israel.
Yes, there was a bribe involved. Yeah. That my father would support me for a year, and I would live in the community of singles, religious, Jewish singles. And
the irony being that we're recording on Shabbat. So go on.
Mm-hmm. Things have changed. Yeah. Exactly.
I could see your arms also.
You know a lot of how this works. But I shared an apartment with other women, and it was in a really lovely part of Jerusalem called Katamon, where there's a lot of buildings of Jerusalem stone, a lot of the Mediterranean flora that you would expect, and I would take long walks, and I think that some of the essence of that went into the atmosphere of Tamerlane. Mm-hmm. So it would, even though, I began with the Celts and, it sort of, it got some Mediterranean dimensions as well.
You got to bring the multicultural aspect, or at least you get to bring these different cultures into a milieu they wouldn't have overlapped in. I guess, was there ever an interest in your part in writing straight historical fiction, or had you always come in with the idea of fantasy so that you could, construct a world instead of having to be, well, there weren't really Jews in the Celtic era, but, that's.
What I love about fantasy is that it's a work of the imagination. And I can do something like, in the case of Last Song Before Night, set out to explore what art means to me. And I have all these tools at my disposal with which to do it. That I would not have if I were writing straight historical fiction and were committed to accuracy, and also didn't have at my disposal the supernatural elements that I think that I love to use as a means to explore various themes and ideas.
What does art mean to you?
Well, I don't think there's any real answer to that in the end. Mm-hmm. I could cheat and say, the answer's in my book, but, I see these explorations as a journey rather than as, well, I did hope at one time to find an answer, but, apparently life isn't like that.
That's the answer. That's when we figure out we've grown up, when we're not actually going to find the answers in the back of the book.
Yes.
Speaking of the back of the book, so you're raised observant? Traditional?
Yes, extremely.
Orthodox? Okay.
Not ultra-Orthodox. There are differences.
Yeah.
In our society, there's not much of an awareness of those differences. People they think Orthodox, they think the black hats, and there's obviously more to it than that. Mm-hmm. I was raised more what in Israel, because Israel, they have more of a sensibility of the differences. They would call it religious Zionist, I guess. But in the end, it ends up being just as stringent as ultra-Orthodox in its own way. Mm-hmm. Maybe, a bit less. I was allowed to watch movies, I was allowed to read books, albeit somewhat grudgingly when it became obvious that I really cared about them. But and I was utterly devout.
Can you talk about how that changed for you?
A lot of things happened, but I think it was just a matter. I mean, I can't say just in this. It was a very long process. When I left Israel as an 18-year-old and I came to New York, certain things began to break down. It just started off with I was in a place where I was angry because bad things had happened, and obviously prayers didn't work. So I was like, I'm not going to pray anymore. That was probably the first thing but I was still religious. I just was, mad at God, which is still a religious position to take.
Yeah. No, I'm here.
Yeah. And, I got on the internet and there were all these, this is actually very funny. It's going to sound like this is the nerdiest thing I could possibly say on this podcast, but I got very into these discussion boards on Amazon that they had at one time. Were you aware of this?
They used to have those, yeah.
Yes, I was on those all the time. I know the Wayback Machine could probably uncover the most embarrassing things. And I met a lot of awful people that way, actually, but I also met some really good people. Mm-hmm. But what I mostly discovered was this revelation that will sound funny to you because it's so obvious, but it's not obvious to a religious Jewish kid, was that we are all the same. That these people who had a completely different life from me, who, weren't Jewish, didn't follow any of the things I was raised with, we were all the same psychologically in every way. And it just became, these differences are starting to feel kind of arbitrary. And then, I went to college and, as we know, knowledge is a dangerous thing. And I took this astronomy course for my science requirement. It was incredibly dull. The teacher did not care at all. It was one of those huge lecture halls where the teacher was a tiny dot at the bottom. But one thing that he said, and this will sound ridiculous, but he was trying to convey to us the size of the quasars. And I forget how he did it, but it was some metaphor. It struck me like, that is massive. That is incredible. And then I thought, how is it possible that the God who created the quasars cares about the length of my skirt? It can't.
That he wants you to dress like it's 1860s Poland.
Why would that God care about what anyone is wearing?
And that was the moment your brain kind of opened up. That
was one of the little cracks that let light in, or whatever it is Leonard Cohen says.
How was your Hebrew? I remember reading an interview with you where you'd mentioned in your teen years you're supposed to be studying Hebrew, but in fact were writing your fantasy novel longhand in a notebook. Did you get back and manage to get Hebrew under your belt, or not?
You have a lot covered. What I was supposed to be doing, this is what people believed could happen. They thought they could just put me in a classroom with other Israelis, and I would somehow absorb through osmosis the language and, learn. And there are kids for whom this works, apparently. I met some of them, and they became completely Israeli. And I
had a Russian pal who was 7 or so when his family got to America, and they threw him into American classroom, and,
Well, but 7 is like...
But that's a younger... You're more plastic at that point. 12, exactly. 13...
No. And so it just... Whatever it was that people were hoping was going to happen was not working. Mm-hmm. I would look at the teacher and I did not understand a thing. And I thought, this is a waste of my time. It was actually really maddening, that waste of time.
Also, because they're Israelis, they're constantly shouting. That's also an issue.
Well,
not always, but...
It was, they were probably not very good teachers. That's a different issue because that was a very religious school. But... I needed something to occupy my time since I didn't understand what the heck was going on in class. And I knew I wanted to write. And I was actually very serious about it, even as a teenager. If I had known about Aragon, I probably would have been really mad, Because Because I didn't think you could actually publish as a teenager. I just thought, I'll get my start now.
Yeah.
And I wrote a book. And, I actually don't, in light of what's around, I don't even know if it's that bad.
Maybe that's the one you submit under a pseudonym.
No, it's not up to my standards.
Mm-hmm.
But I it was meaningful, though, to write that book.
Yeah. And did your Hebrew get any better?
Over time, it did. I remember by 11th grade, it was starting to get better. What I would do was, in order to study for tests, I would start studying like 2 weeks before the test with the textbook and Hebrew English dictionary. And I would just very slowly read the textbooks with the Hebrew English dictionary, and I'd fall asleep a lot, and then I'd wake up and start over. And that process, eventually taught me some Hebrew. Mm-hmm. But it's still, I would not say it's one of my strongest skills.
Again, it's apparently, I spoke it a little bit when I was little kid. But eventually, my parents decided solely to settle on English. Except when they were fighting in my late single-digit years, at which point they would just shout at each other in Hebrew and Yiddish, and my brother and I would be completely out of the loop on this stuff. Although the connotation was, Mom and Dad are angry, they're speaking in Hebrew or Yiddish, so, it didn't really help along those lines.
Wait, so are your parents Israeli?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Oh, so hence the name Gil.
Yeah.
Oh, that's an interesting
And my
fact.
brother Boaz. Yeah, so...
That's really interesting.
And my half-brother Shahar. Yeah, we let's see. Mom was 1940, London Zionist family, moved to Israel in the early 60s. Dad was 38, Bucharest, fled as a refugee in 46, 47, got to Haifa a few months before independence. So they met working for El Al and came to America mid-60s, and I am the endpoint of Jewish history in Ringwood, New Jersey. So,
that's so interesting. Your mother has a similar trajectory to my grandmother, except, my grandmother was on the Kindertransport from Germany to England. And she told me she wanted to go to Israel to fight in the War of Independence. She was probably about 18 by then, and her father wouldn't let her. And she still would talk about it with, disappointment to this day. She was like, I wanted to fight. But instead she went to America and met my grandfather, who was Israeli, actually. Mm-hmm. But yeah, that's interesting.
Issues visiting Germany?
Big issues visiting Germany, which is a shame because it looks beautiful and I probably will go someday. But weirdly enough, even though it was so long ago, I'm still angry.
Yeah. I'm hip. It was my first time was very, very difficult. It's only in the last 10 years. And a Jewish American writer, scholar, talked me through it with, Gil, Germany's okay. They've been addressing it and, dealing with it back and forth, for decades. It's Poland and places like that where they don't admit anything happened. That's the places I have hangups about. I'm like, oh, that's a good way of looking at it. Okay, I'll deal. And in fact, my Germany experiences were fine. Although my first day there, I was visiting a client company for my pharmaceutical trade magazine at the time, and now trade association, and inadvertently ended up locked behind a 10-foot fence topped with barbed wire.
Oh, come on.
Because it was a high security facility, and they realized as they were about to use the badge to go through the turnstile, only one person could go through every 10 minutes. Literally my first day in Germany. I look up and realize I'm behind a wall and barbed wire and think,
no,
Rabbi told me this was going to happen. I didn't think it would be the first day here. Luckily, they were able to send security around and bring me out. But
man.
Yeah.
That's dark.
I'm glad we got this moment together. But yeah, that was my initial German experience. Since then, it's been fine every time I go back, partly because, as one of my pals said, you look more Aryan than the locals, so you really shouldn't be hung up about it.
Yeah, you can get away with it. I have the nose.
Yeah, somewhat,
I'm not ashamed of it.
No, I play up the neurotic Jewish thing as best I can. In fact, the second day there, I was going through the train station. My hotel was close by, and I started hearing chanting and stomping in the station, which of course makes me assume they're coming for me because I was in Frankfurt and this is what's going to happen. Turned out to be a visiting soccer team, and their fans were coming in and chanting, and they happened to have the same colors as a scarf I was wearing. So I felt like I managed to escape another bullet on that one. But, it's, I could see why it's problematic for you too. So
it's not, for me, it's not that I'm afraid. There are definitely places that are more dangerous for Jews and more dangerous for Israelis in particular than Germany. It's just more, I don't know how it will feel emotionally.
It's weird.
Yeah.
Part of that first day experience, and I shouldn't do all the talking, but I saw a kid come out of a pharmacy with a T-shirt that had a fist coming down on a swastika with the word Gegen Nazis on it.
Nice.
And my PR person is driving me around. I'm tapping away on my phone trying to figure out what this is. Turns out it's an anti-Nazi.
Well, that's what I assume.
Pro-tolerance game. But I didn't know what Gegen meant at the time, so that was.
I don't either. But
as it turned out, though, neither did the French. This gang visited France for a friendly national soccer match between Germany and France, and German team scores, and this team the fans unfurl this big banner of a fist coming down on a swastika with Gegen Nazis, at which point the cops come up and start beating the crap out of them and arrest all of them because you're flying a swastika in a French stadium. Not a smart move. Their lawyers got them off by explaining it was a pro-tolerance gang. But again, these things can get misinterpreted really, really easily. So,
Wow.
Yeah. So I'm saying you might want to put off that trip for a while. That's all I'm getting at. But what does Israel mean to you? I mean, I know it's family. I know it's key years of your life. How does it fit into who you are?
Wow, that's a huge question.
I know. I figured I'd soften you up with some slapstick and stand up about Germany.
It's kind of one of those. It feels like a wound some of the time because of the way it's regarded worldwide. It's interesting because I don't consider myself particularly into it. I don't really want to live there. Mm-hmm. I'm not into the Hebrew. But it's very important to me that it's there. And I see that as going beyond refuge from anti-Semitism, even though that's extremely important. I see that as, going back to the songs that we used to sing on Shabbat that were very old tunes, probably from before anyone ever knew the term Zionism, that were just about longing for Jerusalem. And I think it's something really intrinsic to Jewish identity, whether we're actually living there or not. Because without our history and without our traditions, who are we? And I refuse to be somebody who doesn't have an identity.
We're Americans. That's the whole point of being American.
Nah.
In some respects. No, I'm with you. I'm not.
I am an American.
I agree with you, but that's part of America is supposed to be this sense of uprootedness almost.
But isn't it also supposed to be a place where every culture can feel validated in its own right?
Sure.
That's what we're told anyhow.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be any different for Jewish people.
Yeah. In practice, that's What's your favorite food when you're over there?
When I'm over there?
Yeah. Is there something you, man, I can't wait till I'm back there and I can stop at X to pick up Y.
Halloumi sandwiches.
I only ask because I had a Arab pizza maker in Jaffa back when I was 13 who just knocked me and my brother out. Saeed Abu Lafia, which is probably a common name over there, but still that was...
No, it's not. Yeah. That's a Kabbalist Abu Lafia, I think. I could be wrong. But, yeah, I know. What I'm supposed to say is falafel, right? Except weirdly enough, when I'm there, I never have falafel.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. Do you have, Ilana type things that you dig when you're over there as opposed to the stereotype stuff?
Well, I would only be able to tell you about my favorite places to go out to eat more than like specific foods. Mm-hmm. Little places in Jerusalem that we really like that might have closed by now.
When was the last time you were back?
It was a few years ago.
Not to make you feel guilty, although
I do feel guilty.
As you should. We're Jewish, so.
Yeah, no. At this point, I am overdue for a visit. It was a few years ago.
Let me ask, within the books, I mean, you talked about the fraught politics within Israel, and one of the things that strikes me about both novels is the intense politics and political machinations of the world. That is not simply a quest novel or two novels. They're very grounded in what it means to live in these kingdoms or states as they are. Where's that come from for you? That sense of grounding these things in a political reality?
I think that
how do you balance that also with character and quest? Sorry to cut you off.
Not at all. I think anyone who has read enough of history can't really escape that integral part of human history. The way we develop traditions and attachments to places, and the way political realities can affect us, sometimes in ways that we don't even realize.
Mm-hmm. I guess what I'm asking is, you seem conscious of those in the course of writing. Like it does seem as though you're making sure that we understand we live in a world where there are forces bigger than us in terms of politics and interactions with people. It's something that I really dug about both books. Not being much of a fantasy reader, that was the first thing my wife was like, "What are you reading?" I showed her. She's like, "That's not your standard thing." I'm like, "I know, but it's for the show, so that's
and I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's when I fall into mystery novels that it gets even stranger. I'm like, really not the area that I'm focused on, but whatever, I'll read anything. But yeah, it did strike me that they're very aware of being in a state, not just characters who are in cocoons off doing their own thing. So
I'm glad to hear it. That it was intentional.
I hope so. Who were your writing influences? First when you were young, and then as you started working particularly within fantasy?
When I was young, I read everything I could get my hands on. But I knew from a very early age that I loved what I called books with magic in them, because there was no term fantasy back then, and those books were not segregated in their own shelf. It was just, books with magic in them. And at the same time as I was reading, all of Ellen Montgomery's books, Anne of Green Gables and on, Frances Hodgson Burnett, Little Princess, Secret Garden, Lost Prince. I mean, these were all really important books for me. When I look back, I think probably one of some of the hallmarks of those books are the way they combine character with this sense of an enchantment and beauty in the world. One of my favorite books of all time still is The Weston Game. Mm-hmm. Have you read that?
No, I haven't.
Oh, it's just this...
I'm going to sound like a moron. Who's it by?
Not at all. You're not a moron. It's by Ellen Raskin. Mm-hmm. It's a children's book, but it's just... It might have been one of the most influential books on me in terms of thinking about character, about character development.
How so?
And that's what the whole book is.
Mm-hmm.
And every line of the book just about gives you a hint to who these people are, and then over time how they change. And it's funny. It's just a wonderful book. So that was formative. And then, of course, the Narnia books and the Chronicles of Prydain by Lloyd Alexander. Really huge cornerstones for me.
Was there a teacher who was influential in those terms, or were you already so driven in this stuff and stuck in that milieu where the teachers in Israel had no idea what to do with you, that you were sort of self-guided?
Well, as a kid, I was still in America, but no, teachers didn't really do much in that area. I was just very fortunate that I had a library card and could roam free in the children's section and, and was able to find these things. And once in a while, a friend would point me in the right direction. Like, I remember it was a friend who gave me The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. You know, who knows if I would have found it if not. All these things happened by accident.
Mm. And look at you now. So dragons, are they going to show up in your... Just to harken back to the beginning of the conversation.
Right, dragons. Yeah. God bless.
Next series?
I'm happy for other people to enjoy dragons. I just don't really see the point myself.
Peer, now that you're a published author, peer that you were happiest about meeting?
Okay.
Once you started getting into festivals and you know, being an author on the circuit?
Wow. Well, you know...
Is there anyone you freaked out that, oh my God, I got to meet X?
Those things kind of happened before I was published. So, like, you know, my first Worldcon, which was 2004, I met George Martin, you know. Mm-hmm. That was before he was what he is now. And it was actually really funny because I was still Orthodox then, with my long skirt and my long sleeves and my high neck, and I was really shy. And I go into this party, and there's George Martin with these two girls, probably my age. I was, 23 or something at the time, like just all like dressed in like spandex or something, and they were both holding on to one of his arms. Yeah. And Paris was standing right there, and I was kind of like just watching, and they were like, and the girls were like, "Oh, come on over if you want to just bask." And so thinking back on it, it's so funny. So yeah, I met George Martin then, and later I met Guy Gavriel Kay because he was guest of honor actually at Icon in Israel, and that was really special because his books, were also very important to me. And I went to a book event for Tad Williams in Borders in the World Trade Center before September 11th. So I got to meet Tad Williams. So, really, I kind of took care of that all before I got into the industry. Mm-hmm. And at this point, I don't know if there's anybody I would be that over the moon to meet. I don't know if I have those kinds of feelings anymore. No,
now you're supposed to be the person who elicits those in readers. When someday you'll have, two hunks in spandex, flanking you at Worldcon.
The dream.
Yeah. Now let's get back to book 3. Is there a time frame that we should? I know book 2 is just out now in Fire Dance, but what's the plan in terms of not that writing has a plan, but
yeah, I know it's more. Well, the writing has a plan, and then it does whatever it wants with me. Mm-hmm. I really want to finish this book this year. I'm aiming for the fall, but I really don't know. I do not work quickly. I took a year. It was almost a year. It wasn't supposed to be, but it kind of ended up being a year to do additional research before I began the book. And so that knocked out some time. And, to be perfectly honest, the election stuff knocked out some time. But so at the moment...
Just in terms of a low-level buzz of irritation that keeps you from getting anything done, and with the occasional spikes of anger and rage?
Well, for me, it began early, even before the election itself, because I was one of those people who was targeted by Bernie bros who might have been real and might have been bots, and who knows. And I, felt like it was a time when I could not afford to be silent. I felt like something very dangerous was coming, and it was a responsibility to pay attention and to speak out. And oh well. So that happened, and that took quite a bit of time and was obviously for nothing. So that was quite a bit of 2016. Oh, and just as a fun side note, the paperback of Last Song Before Night came out on Election Day.
I must have felt
that
celebratory.
That was just wonderful.
It was a Tuesday. That makes sense.
That was just wonderful.
Yeah. What is a writing day like for you? And it's the last question, I promise.
That's all good. A writing day is basically me trying to get as much work done as early as possible because that is when I have my best energy. So that's, really the goal is always to make sure I have time in the morning because I know after that, no matter what happens, it's just not the same. And once I lose my best energy and I hopefully have some words, I'll then usually try to take the time to do some reading, either something that will help the book or something just to enrich me in some way that I might not even know can help or not, because you really just never know where things will come from. Or, household things that have to be done.
I'll let you get back to it. Ilana, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you so much, Gil.
And that was Ilana C. Myer. Her new novel is Fire Dance from Tor Books. While it works okay on its own, you really ought to read her previous novel, Last Song Before Night, also from Tor. Her website is ilanacmyer.com, which is ILANACMYER.com. She's on Twitter as IlanaCT, and she's pretty active there. It's a pretty good Twitter feed, so you should definitely follow that. Now, after we wrapped, I asked Ilana, so, who you reading? And if you want to hear her answer to that, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The newest episode of that one features 40 minutes of new material from Dave McKean, Paul Karasik, Mark Newgarden, Seymour Quast, John Leland, Ann Hulbert, Henry Wessels, Lauren Weinstein, Jerry Beck, Willard Spiegelman, Levi Tadar, Jesse Scheidlauer, and Robert Weil. You can support the Virtual Memories show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my new secret project that I feel guilty about, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this episode as part of a batshit crazy 4 podcasts in 3 boroughs of New York day. Ilana was the first guest and thus the first borough. The whole day involved a bunch of toll bridges, about $16 in parking, 2 subway trips, and a lot of driving, along with a couple of coffee breaks. And if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. Special thanks go out to John Wendler, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Stephen Nadler, Wallace Wilde Minozzi, Noah Van Sciver, Andrew Mason, Greg Tanner, Garrett Zecker, Michael Hacker, Craig P. Steffen, Jack Lescamella, Joe Caruso, Paul Karasik, Michael Janizik, and Stephen Solomon for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Nothing's Gonna Bring Me Down by David Bayerwald, used with permission from the artist. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. Next week's guest will be Christopher Brown, author of the novel Tropic of Kansas. Until then, you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com and on YouTube and tunein.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. That'll help us build a bigger audience. You've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.